big part of supply chain is understanding who are the players, who are these channel partners that we mentioned just a moment ago. Well, the two most important ones, apart from the customer, the final consumer, are the buyers and sellers of merchandise. Importers, exporters, buyers, sellers, shippers, consignees. These are all synonymous terms that we'll use interchangeably in our supply chain management conversation. But it all starts with a buyer and a seller. Somebody somewhere has to manufacture goods. It might not be the buyer and the seller that's the manufacturer. It could be that third-party environment, but somebody somewhere has to manufacture goods. They play an important role. Tier 1, Tier 2, and Tier 3 suppliers. This terminology actually is specific to the automotive industry, and we'll talk more about that in subsequent modules. But basically, when you tier a supplier network, that is to say that a Tier 1 supplier will sell directly to a manufacturer. So the manufacturer of seats that goes into an automobile, that's a Tier 1 manufacturer. The company that sells the springs that go into the seat, that's a Tier 2, because the Tier 2 will sell to the Tier 1, who puts the springs in the seat and then sells to the manufacturer. So you get the picture. A Tier 3 might be the company that sells the rods that ultimately become springs. But it's a tiered environment where the Tier 1 supplier sells directly to the manufacturer. And although not limited to automotive, this type of terminology, Tier 1, Tier 2, Tier 3, was born definitely in the automotive sector. Other entities are banks, who's financing these purchases and sales, insurance firms, cargo insurance firms, etc., freight forwarders, the companies that organize transportation, customs entities like Customs and Border Protection in the United States play a huge role. The customs brokers, these are the companies that help importers to determine what it is they're importing and how to present those goods to the customs entity for customs clearance. That's related closely to CHB. So a customs broker will engage in CHB activities. And then, depending on what it is, what type of goods are being shipped and ultimately imported into a country, you might be dealing with what are called OGAs. And you'll hear this acronym fairly frequently. It's another government agency. So whereas in the United States, if you're an importer, you're always going to have to deal with Customs and Border Protection. If you're importing food products, you might be dealing with the Food and Drug Administration, the U.S. Department of Agriculture. If you import footwear that's made out of alligator skin or crocodile skin, you might be dealing with Fish and Wildlife. Those are just examples of OGAs. So as you plan your supply chain activities, depending on what it is you do, you may have to consider the involvement of these OGAs. Some other players, the truckers at origin and destination, the airlines and steamship lines, the steamship lines being the vessel operators that carry those containers we talked about in Module 1, rail companies in the U.S., in Asia, in Europe, and Latin America, warehousing companies, the national mail, definitely part of global supply chains. That's the United States Postal Service and others around the world. Small parcel, smaller packages that are handled by UPS and companies like FedEx. Fulfillment houses. These are typically e-commerce operations where if you go online and purchase a tablet or a smartphone, the order will be fulfilled from one of these warehousing and distribution operations. And in our last bullet point, if you ever had a smartphone that got broken or damaged and had to be shipped back to your service provider, there are companies in the supply chain that all they do on a third-party basis is test these phones or tablets or laptops, see what's wrong with them, fix them, and get them back out into the supply chain. Test and repair is a major industry, albeit behind the scenes, in the supply chain world. Some functional areas. Gave a few examples of a moment ago, but some processes and functional activities. And this is where the whole idea of integrating activities, both internally and externally in an organization, is so important to supply chain. And again, depending on what you do as a company and what strategic decisions you make about how you're going to operate your company. Maybe you do these things internally, maybe you do them externally. That's a company-specific decision. But important areas include finance, research and development for new product introductions, how products are designed, forecasting activities for future sales. Forecasting is arguably, and we'll get into this in more detail later, the foremost important activity of supply chain, because that really sets the stage for what we think is going to happen in our supply chain, and then we have to react when things really start to happen. Sourcing, where do we buy merchandise overseas? Materials planning, how do we determine what level of raw materials we need to go into a production process? That's called MRP. The actual purchasing of products, sales and marketing on the export side. Production planning, especially if we manufacture our own goods, but also working collaboratively with third-party partners if we outsource our manufacturing. One of the biggest mistakes that companies made starting some 20 years ago when outsourcing of manufacturing activities really started was that companies assumed once it was outsourced that they didn't have to worry about manufacturing anymore. Couldn't have been anything further from the truth. Even if we as a company, let's say, outsource our manufacturing, we have to have that collaborative planning process in place, starting with a forecast that allows us to manage our relationship with the contract manufacturer better. More on that a little later on. Inbound and outbound logistics, import and export transportation, basically. Information technology as a major role in supply chain. Customer service. We have a whole module dedicated specifically to customer service in a global supply chain environment, so fundamentally important there. Another important topic that's getting a lot more play recently is risk management and legal considerations. How do we as a company comply with U.S. export law? Or how do we as a multinational comply with import regulations in Europe? How do we mitigate risk from things like natural disasters, to piracy, to insurance considerations? So risk management, a whole other subject within the supply chain discipline. Human resources, needless to say, and accounting. So that was a couple of slides that gave a rather lengthy definition of supply chain. Now we're going to give you the short tactical version, which I think, in addition to being a little less wordy, really distills down our definition and really starts to let us focus on certain tactical execution-related activities. I really like this slide. I hope you do too. So the short tactical version of supply chain, it's a time-phased approach to forecasting. First activity in supply chain, forecasting. What do we think is going to happen? And not only forecasting, but meeting the demand for raw materials, work in process, and or finished goods, depending on what we do as a company. If we don't manufacture anything, we just buy finished goods, we don't have to deal with raw materials. On the other hand, if we do manufacture, we definitely handle raw materials, work in process, and finished goods. So it will depend on what our business model is, what we do as a company. But for purposes of this bullet point, this idea of a time-phased approach, time-phased out into the future. What's going to happen in week 1 of 2016? What's going to happen? What's our plan for production in week 20 of 2016? What's our sourcing footprint going to look like in the year 2020? So it's time-phased out into the future. And how do we link up anticipated or forecast demand with supply? And when things start to happen, the future becomes the present, and there's a difference between what we thought was going to happen and what is really happening. How do we make the adjustments in our supply chain so we can remain profitable, meet customer demand, not have a lot of excess product in inventory, all of these things. 4 cornerstones. Supply chain is more than this second bullet point, but if someone were to ask me, give me the elevator version of what supply chain management was, this is right where I'd start. So the 4 cornerstones of supply chain. Product sales. You have to sell something, whether it's wearing apparel or high-tech equipment or medical diagnostic equipment. You have to be selling. But to think that to have a quality product at a fair price is the formula for success in global supply chain, is a naive approach to supply chain. It's a lot more than that. That's the price of admission into the game, to be able to have a quality product at a fair price. Other considerations like landed cost, which we will define in just a moment. Lead time rationalization, meeting delivery obligations to our customers, having our suppliers overseas meet their lead time commitments to us. And then inventory management. I mentioned briefly a moment ago, but where we have product in the supply chain, in what quantity, whose possession is it in, what is the risk of loss or damage to those goods, what is its availability to fill customer orders moving out into that time-phased approach. These are all subjects related to inventory management. Finally, on this slide, technology and cloud-based visibility across the entire supply chain are key to success. I mentioned this earlier as well. The ability to see into our supply chain and know where goods are, in what quantity, in whose possession. When will they be available from customs, for example, in Brazil for a shipment to a large customer in Sao Paulo? We need that visibility. We need that technology, that software, in essence, to be able to plan and respond to differences between what we thought was going to happen in our supply chain and what is really happening. That technology theme, as we saw in Module 1, will continue to be very important throughout each of our tactical conversations and modules.